Okay, thank you for joining us. And I see some folks are still logging on, but we're going to get started so we can make sure there's plenty of time at the end for questions. As before, we'll have our two speakers, one who's kind of the target of a really great effort by our current Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, to suppress free speech, Chris Tomlinson, and then we'll have Allan Van Fleet talk about why that's so legally bad. But before we get started, we're going to have one of the many fugitives from the law that are in an unknown location. And back in 9/11, whenever they talked about how Vice President Dick Cheney was in an undetermined location or hidden location, I always assumed it was the Halliburton headquarters on top of 5 Houston Center. So we're not going to ask Representative Rosenthal to tell us where he is and whether it's even in Texas or not. But he's going to give us his travail so far, what he sees ahead in just a few minutes. And then we're going to get started with Chris and Forget the Alamo. So thank you for joining us, Representative Rosenthal, and fire away.
All right. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I think it's been pretty well stipulated that I've returned to Texas, although I'm being a little coy about my whereabouts, but hopefully it won't matter too much. So what's going on right now, as all of you I'm sure are aware, is we're combating bullying, parliamentary tactics, and they are attempting to pass some really egregious voter suppression legislation, and it's part of a nationwide effort. So we saw this as really, it was the last straw in a long line of red meat issues in a session for us. But because of the national importance of this was why we chose to make a stand at this time. Of course, we went to Washington. We are still fighting this, still trying to kill the session. Many of you may be aware that Representative Gene Wu, successfully obtained and forgive me, I'm an engineer, not a lawyer, but I do think that he obtained a writ of habeas corpus in a local court here. And I'm pretty sure that similar writs are being processed for a large number of Democrats holding out right now. We have had a warrant issued for our arrest by the sergeant at arms in the Texas House. They have not deputized DPS to the best of my knowledge so far. It's first time I've ever had a warrant issued for my arrest, but there you go. Who knew what I was signing up for? The bottom line here is we are fighting now. We will continue to fight. I'm not going to willingly go for the purpose of making a quorum so that they can advance egregious legislation. We certainly don't have enough time to go into how bad this bill is, but suffice to say it's part of a national effort to suppress the vote, change the dynamics of how elections are run and counted, change not only how you count the votes, but who counts the votes, an effort to change who the referees are, really, really undermining our democracy. So if there was anything worth fighting for till the very end, in my opinion, this is it. And I hope that's a reasonable update.
No, it is. One thing, because a long time ago when I was in law school, I used to work the criminal defense attorney. Do you have a toothbrush with you at all times?
No. I should be carrying a toothbrush and a towel, right? I gotta.
It would be. You say that, but it might actually help you quite a bit when you're doing that. But thank you, Representative, for joining us on here. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to introduce Chris Tomlinson, Forget the Alamo. Thank you for joining us from Austin, I understand. And as a practical matter, I know when I invited you, one of the questions was, how much did you have to pay the Lieutenant Governor for royalties to get it out there, to put you on the bestseller list for the New York Times? Chris is a columnist for the Chronicle, Army veteran, reported for a number of years in Africa, is also the author of another bestseller, Tomlinson Hill, which I would also highly recommend. It's about his family's heritage in the Marlin area, as well as the heritage of a Black family that also is called Tomlinson. And in many ways, it kind of presages the work that you've done in Forget the Alamo. So thanks for joining us. And I think the two things everybody wants to know from the get-go is, what's in that book that's so bad? And what's it like to be banned by the Lieutenant Governor of the state? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, for having me, and thank everyone for joining us. It's been quite the journey fighting about the Alamo. It seems like Texans love fighting about the Alamo, and I say that as a fifth-generation Texan. The book originated from a column I wrote about the need for Texas to change its brand, and there was a line in that column that said, most Texans don't realize that the Battle of the Alamo was more about preserving slavery than it was about fighting for liberty. And I mentioned this over breakfast to two writer friends of mine, Jason Stanford and Brian Burrow. And Brian looked at me and goes, "What do you mean? That can't possibly be true." And I looked at him and said, "Everything you think you know about the Alamo is a lie, and it's a lie with a goal of advancing white supremacy, of oppressing Hispanic Texans, and maintaining a regime that, thank goodness, Representative Rosenthal is fighting to prevent from coming back into power in this state." Brian thought that was a book. And my first reaction was, well, we've already got 2,000 books about the Alamo. We really don't need another one. But he sold it to Penguin Press, his publisher in New York. And we set about telling the truth about the Alamo in 3 acts. The first act is the lead up to the battle and the battle itself. What was really the motivating factor for the Texas Revolution? And we drew on a lot of established historians, papers and books that had already been published and written in the past. Nothing, I like to say there was nothing new in the book. There's no original reporting in the book prior to 2019. And, and the historians are pretty clear. The only thing that Santa Anna and the Mexican government wanted to take away from the Anglos in Texas was the right to own slaves. The Mexican Revolution in 1821 was about egalitarianism. They had a Black president. Every other state had banned slavery. And federalism allowed slavery to exist in some form or another up until about 1829 in Texas. And it was only in 1829 that the Mexican government got serious about banning slavery. And that ultimately led to the Anglos taking up arms and eventually fighting and dying at the Alamo. We also report about Santa Anna's letter to the Mexican government before crossing the Rio Grande, announcing his intention to free all of those wretched souls held in the bondage of slavery through his march into Texas. Unfortunately, that seems to be the part that Dan Patrick, and particularly former Land Commissioner Jerry Patterson, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and other right-wing groups that concern themselves with advancing a white supremacist agenda in public schools found so objectionable. Now, I would also point out that the second third of the book is about the myth-making, about how Davy Crockett and Travis and Bowie were turned from drunk leches, incapable of fighting, or defending the Alamo, making huge strategic blunders by not retreating, how they were turned into heroes, how that battle was changed from a hopeless, stupid military blunder into a legendary event. We talk about the invention of the lion in the sand myth that came up in the 1870s and how it was perpetrated and perpetuated. We talk about all of the Jim Crow related mythology that was developed up through the 1950s. The crowning achievements being Walt Disney's Davy Crockett miniseries that led to millions of American little boys putting on coonskin caps and pretending to kill Mexicans. And of course, the ultimate lie is the John Wayne movie, where the only thing accurate about that film is perhaps the names of the people who died at the Alamo. The last third of the book is, I think, the real reason why we got into trouble. We look at the revisionists, the rise of Chicano historians, the rise of real, true, professional historical work that challenged all of those myths, that challenged the idea that the Alamo had strategic importance, challenged the lie that somehow they thought they were fighting to slow down the Mexican army, which they didn't. They didn't even know that Texas had declared independence when the battle took place. And all of this is like well documented. Most of these books were written in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, like Seeds of Empire by Andrew Torgett, or An Empire for Slavery, a book by Randolph Campbell. Then we bring it to the real present day, where we talk about how Jerry Patterson accepted and encouraged the donation of $15 million worth of artifacts from the rock singer Phil Collins, without checking to see if they were really what Phil Collins claimed they were. We investigated the Collins collection, and we discovered that the most important items, the most famous items in that collection, are probably not what Phil Collins claims them to be. They do not have proper provenance. That Phil Collins relied on psychics to tell him that it was Jim Bowie's knife, or that it was Davy Crockett's shot pouch, and that sort of thing. So we kind of embarrassed Jerry Patterson by pointing out the foolishness of this acquisition and the foolishness of trying to raise $450 million to build a new Alamo Plaza as a monument to white supremacists fighting for slavery in a city that is the largest majority minority city in the country. Then we explain how Dan Patrick betrayed George P. Bush and cut him off at the knees, and basically threw the whole Alamo redevelopment plan into a mess because he thought that George P. Bush was going to challenge him in his reelection as lieutenant governor. Again, an embarrassing episode for Patrick, showing his duplicity and his willingness to use power politics and, frankly, the Alamo legend to punish George P. Bush for aspiring to higher office. So presumably, a lot of the complaints by Dan and we also talk about Texas Public Policy Foundation's role in trying to reverse all of the progress that was made in the 1990s toward teaching a balanced, accurate version of Texas history, and how TPPF used its political power and its donations to roll back accuracy in Texas history seventh grade classrooms. So am I surprised that the con men who sold, or the alleged con men that sold questionable artifacts to Phil Collins are angry with me? I'm not. Am I surprised that Jerry Patterson is angry that I've embarrassed him and his involvement in the acquisition of those artifacts? Not really. Texas Public Policy Foundation, of course, they're angry with us for pointing out how they're trying to push a false version of Texas history on our school children. And Dan Patrick I've been covering him first as a regular reporter for the Associated Press, and now as a columnist for the Houston Chronicle for a long time. We both know each other on site. We don't like each other. And I think that my columns make him angry. And clearly this was an opportunity for him to lash out. So that kind of sets the groundwork. It is a national release of a book. It is more an argument for a version of the facts, a perspective on the facts. It is an argument against a white supremacist, whitewashed version of Texas history. And in that way, we never intended it to be a textbook. It was always supposed to be an argument backed by fact. We have 12 pages of bibliography and endnotes. We have extensive sourcing for every assertion that we make. And yet, that hasn't kept critics from coming after us, especially Jerry Patterson, who in his retirement has decided to make killing our book his cause celeb. And he used all of his he actually restarted a dormant Twitter account just to come after us. We have since seen him use social media, but he also used his political connections. So when we were booking appearances before the book came out, we were honored that we were getting hundreds of requests. And we had requests from the Bullock Texas State History Museum, a public institution managed by the State Preservation Board or overseen by the State Preservation Board. And we also received an invitation from the Writers League of Texas. And they both wanted to hold an event a couple of weeks after the launch to give members a chance to read the book and be able to have a discussion. We were so overbooked that we suggested that we have a joint event. And this was still COVID, so we agreed to do it online. And the deal was that the Bullock would use their platform, their video platform, and their membership list and their technology to promote and register attendance and virtually host the event. The Writers League of Texas would also promote the event among their membership and on their social media accounts. And then the executive director would be the moderator. And we thought this was all great. And we thought that this would go off like any other of our events. A few hundred people would be attending, and we would talk about, in this case, how we write about history. And we write we're not historians, we write as journalists. We write popular books, we don't write textbooks. We are deliberately provocative and want to have a good time with history. It's full of jokes, many of them self-deprecating. And we were going to talk about that, the how you write about history in a popular form for a popular audience. The first sign of trouble came when Kevin Roberts, the director of TPPF, sent out a tweet saying that he could not believe that a state institution like the Bullock would host people like us, who wrote a book like us, and that he called on the governor, lieutenant governor, the Speaker of the House, and Senator Charles Schwertner to intervene with the Bullock to cancel our event. That came out on a Tuesday. I immediately alerted everyone, the Bullock, the Writers League, agents, publicists, publisher, said, hey, look, TPPF is coming after us. Making no mention of the fact that we criticized TPPF in the book. We received assurances from the Bullock that, hey, we've held events where we criticized the Texas Rangers in the past. They've had books that are even more controversial from a historical perspective than Forget the Alamo, and that there would be no problem that we were going to go on as planned. And that was the message that we received on Wednesday. I was driving from Houston back to Austin on Thursday afternoon ahead of the event. And about 3 hours before we were supposed to go live, the Writers League of Texas notified us that she had been contacted by the Bullock that our event had been canceled and that it was due to the political pressure from the right-wing groups, and that if we wished to proceed, we could we could go on social media and hopefully shift every of the platform where over 300, almost 400 people were pre-registered to see our event, and shift them over to the Writers League Zoom page. My immediate response was, we don't have time. We don't have time to save that audience. We also, don't completely understand what the Bullock is doing. They did not contact us directly. They did not contact our publicists. The Bullock just went completely silent. No messages, no communication, nothing at all. The only thing we knew was what was coming through the Writers League. And I considered that to be kind of a fluid situation, didn't completely understand what was going on, and said, listen, let's postpone. Let's try to reschedule with the Bullock. Let's try to figure out what's happening, but trying basically to go from the equivalent of the Bullock Theater with hundreds of seats to have them lock us out at the last minute, and for the Writers League director to say, oh, well, let's just bring everyone over to my little living room and we'll see who can fit and try to have the event anyway. And I was like, no, that shouldn't happen. Let's at the minimum, let's rebook with the Writers League. I went on to Twitter. I said, listen, we've been canceled by a state institution that's under political pressure, and did a series of 6 tweets that soon went viral, reaching over 1 million people. And that is where things stood until the next morning, when the lieutenant governor came out and said, yes, I used my authority as a member of the State Preservation Board to cancel this fact-free book. And so it was, he basically said, I use my power to prevent these people from speaking at a state institution. And it was my prerogative, and I would do it again in a minute. He has since used the cancellation of our event in campaign fundraising emails, bragging about his defense of the great state of Texas. We talked to the ACLU and to the First Amendment Law Clinic at Southern Methodist University. We wrote a letter. They wrote a letter on our behalf to the Preservation Board and to the Bullock, demanding that they reinstate the event with equal PR, equal promotion, and basically a do-over, a chance to reschedule. And we have heard nothing back from them. And we're considering our future steps. We have a lot to consider, including the amount of time that litigation would require. There's also some question about whether, how much of our work product we would have to present in discovery. And so there, as I'm sure Allan will explain, this is a complex thing. It's not as simple as going to a judge and saying, hey, my First Amendment right has been violated, please fix it. And so I'm really kind of excited to hear what Allan has to say about the legal situation. But I just want to reiterate, to me, the fascinating parts of this are that the criticism has been completely focused on our contention that slavery was a major factor in the Texas Revolution. And this is, among professional historians, an indisputable fact. Now, some will say it was only maybe 30% of the cause. Others will say it was 80% of the cause for the revolution, but no one doubts the role of slavery in the revolution. And yet that is the thing that's the argument that we make that our critics have the biggest problem with. And so it is a question of our perspective on what is arguably an issue that will probably be debated forever. I would also note that none of these people who are our critics are acknowledging the fact that each one of them they are criticized in the book. They have an interest in suppressing it and making sure that people don't read it. And so to me, that's equally fascinating. I think that's about all I have to contribute. I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm looking forward to hearing the legal perspectives on this. But I want to say that more disturbingly is that the more attention that we get, the more unpleasant the critics have become. We have received death threats. We have received threats to beat us up. When we spoke at the San Antonio, or at the Bexar County Commissioner's Court in San Antonio, there were threats against the event and threats against us. We had to have extra high security. For the first time since I left Somalia, I had a personal security detail escorting me around. And I would say that, you know, Jerry Patterson had a chance to stand up and have his say at that event, but then his assistant began heckling me as I was speaking. So things seem to be escalating a little bit. The social media attacks have escalated in the last few days. And the lieutenant governor has demanded that the State University of Texas hold basically a show trial of our book. And I was contacted today by the University of Texas, and they proposed a panel that did not include any University of Texas faculty, that was kind of loaded up with Jerry and some of our critics. And I think they're clearly trying to appease the lieutenant governor more than they are concerned about having an honest conversation. So this is continuing, and I'll keep everyone informed about what happens next. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. What an honor it is to appear with you. Before being asked to come on this, I have read the book. It is a superb read. It is well documented, and it takes us away from the story, the heroic Anglo narrative that I was taught in 7th grade by none other than the Texas History comic strips movie version. I don't even think we had an actual textbook otherwise. So I'm going to share with y'all some slides, because that's what lawyers do, and also because I am going to go through some of the legal principles that we have here. So I am asked to be here because, as Chris told quite dramatically, they were literally canceled by the Bullock Museum from doing a program that the Bullock had not only signed on for, but publicized and did with the Writers Association. And about 4 p.m. of that day, the museum said, we're canceling it, literally canceling it. So what are the legal standards for their doing that kind of thing? We go back to a 1983 opinion by Justice White in the case of the Perry Education Association versus the Perry Local Educators Association. These are two teachers' unions, by the way, we'll get to. But what White set out is that when you're looking at how government can and when government can restrict use of public forums, you have to determine what kind of forum it is. If it's a traditional or sometimes called quintessential public forum, such as a street or a park where through the centuries people have gotten up and expressed their views, that is the most protected. There is a second category called limited or sometimes designated public forums, which we're going to focus on today. And this is public property that the state has opened for use by the public as a place for expressive activity. Finally, the most restrictive could be a designated non-public forum, such as a military base that is not by tradition or designation a government piece of property that's a forum for public communication. And the standards differ depending on what kind of forum we're looking at. If it's one of these traditional, if it's the streets, the park, the area in front of City Hall, the government cannot impose any content-based restrictions unless they are just necessary to achieve a compelling state interest and are narrowly drawn to achieve that end. Lawyers will recognize that as strict scrutiny, the most insightful examination and critique of government action. Now, you can have content neutral time, place, manner restrictions in these quintessential public fora, but only if those are narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. And those regulations nevertheless leave ample alternative channels for people to gather and express themselves. That's the traditional, the quintessential public forums, the public parks, the public streets. In the middle are these limited or designated public forums, such as, for example, a state university could create a campus free speech zone, essentially an open mic where everybody's welcome to come and express their views on this, that, or another subject. Another example might be a public library, even a library attached to a museum where folks are invited to come. Now, the courts are not going to find a designated public forum absent some clear indication that the government intended to have it open as a forum. It doesn't need to be a written policy. You can look at the historic way that the property has been used by the state, by the public, and find that it's a public forum that way. But finally, even in those non-public fora, such as the military base, on those, the government can impose time, place, manner restrictions, and they could bar speakers altogether. But the exclusion has to be reasonable, and it can't be an effort to suppress expression merely because public officials oppose the speaker's view. All right. The courts also look at content and non-content discrimination. These content-based laws, where we focus on what you're trying to say, they're presumptively unconstitutional. They're subject to strict scrutiny. The highest form of judicial review, where if we're talking about the hours of operation or maybe even the number of people in a room that don't go to the content of what's being said, those need only survive intermediate scrutiny. Now, for example, the Supreme Court in 1988 invalidated a DC law that prohibited the display of signs that were critical of foreign government within a certain distance outside their embassies. Content related, you're out. But they did, 4 years later, upheld a campaign-free zone where nobody can say anything relating to the election within the 100 feet of the polling places. We've all had to deal with that as we are election judges and poll watchers. Now, let me say, while these criteria may seem clear, a lot of these decisions are 5-4. And you don't always know. But the content restriction focus is something that is still alive and well. In 2015, the court, almost unanimously, but not quite, struck down an Arizona ordinance in the town of Gilbert that said you can't put any kind of political signs, vote for Joe, on our public streets. But once that got to the Supreme Court, they struck it down and saying that is content control because you allow directional signs. You allow turn right here, no left turn here, but you can't put up a sign that says vote left, stamp out the right. And that radical liberal Justice Thomas wrote the opinion that included an observation that a law that is content-based on its face is subject to strict scrutiny, regardless of the government's benign motive, content-neutral justification, or even lack of animus toward the ideas contained in the regulated speech. Pretty strong stuff. Now, a particular variety of content discrimination is viewpoint discrimination. If I ban all speeches in a public park, that's content discrimination. That's content-based. But if I pass a law, an ordinance that bars speeches by communists or socialists, that's viewpoint-based. And that receives the strictest of scrutiny. As Justice Kennedy said in 1995, viewpoint discrimination is an egregious form of content discrimination, And decades earlier, Justice Marshall wrote that the First Amendment means that government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. So let's go and take a look at whether the Bullock Museum is one of these designated public fora that the government can't restrict speech based on content or viewpoint. Going back to that Perry Education Association case, this was kind of a remarkable holding that said the school system could allow the incumbent teachers union to use the school mail system to promote their positions, but deny an up and coming union that wanted to replace the union as the teacher's representative. You can't use the school mail system. It was a 5-4 case, and it went off on the holding that the school mail system was never intended to be a public forum. And so they could allow the folks who were already representing the teachers to be part of that educational community, but bar everybody else. But with that in mind, very recently, a form of question has come up about whether social media can be designated as a public forum. You may remember the controversy about President Trump barring people from putting posts on his Twitter site that were critical of him. Well, folks sued both in the Second Circuit and Fourth Circuit, and in the First Amendment Institute of Columbia University. Some folks you guys probably ought to talk to, Chris, along with the UCLA. They brought these two cases. And in New York and in the Second Circuit, they won the courts holding that Trump violated the First Amendment by removing this interactive space on his Twitter account and barring folks who were critical of him or his policy. They said that this interactive space was a designated public forum. Blocking people because of their viewpoint was discriminatory and violated the First Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court in April vacated the ruling, sent it back with instructions to dismiss it as moot, presumably because one, Trump is no longer president, and two, Twitter canceled him anyway. So that was out. Just last month, exactly 1 month ago, our illustrious Attorney General Ken Paxton had the same problem and backed down, saying he would no longer block people on his Twitter account, essentially the same case as the Trump case, but here on a local level. So looking at the Bullock Museum, as Chris alluded, it is owned by, it is controlled by the State Preservation Board, whose board of directors include Abbott, Patrick, Phelan, those people who are elected leaders, politicians, members of government. Lest there be no doubt, the State Preservation Board itself was established by the ledge. It is a branch of government, as is the Bullock Museum. Do they open themselves up to events? Well, they certainly did once for Chris and his colleagues, but on the webpage, they tell you, we'd love for you to come. Any kind of event you want, a wedding, a mitzvah, bar or bot, movie screenings, anything else you want. Now, they do say we reserve the right to refuse the museum's use for any event that's inconsistent with the mission and responsibility of a state-funded institution. And in particular, they say fundraising needs to be approved, and we do not allow fundraising for political candidates. We do not allow political candidates to use it as a forum. So, that may or may not survive a look at content discrimination, but at least it doesn't have any viewpoint discrimination. We're going to only allow incumbent politicians to fundraise. We're only going to allow Republicans. We're only going to allow this kind of stuff with the approval of the governor or the board of directors. So, but lest there be no mistake, Patrick, Lieutenant Governor, was very clear that the reason the facility, this state-owned facility, was denied to Chris and his colleagues and a discussion of the book was not with any doubt viewpoint discrimination. Now, nobody's going to say that you can't talk Texas history at the Texas History Museum. Nobody's going to say you can't talk about the founding of the Republic or the Battle of the Alamo at the Bullock Museum, because that's what we're all about. His problem was specifically with the viewpoint that Chris and Forget the Alamo took. As he said, this fact-free rewriting of Texas history has no place at the Bullock Museum. They were canceled. They were denied access strictly because of the views expressed in their book and in their opinion. I was asked to touch just briefly on another aspect of official cancel culture, and that would be in HB 3979. It was passed in the last session, signed into the law, and addresses what must and what you don't have to require be taught in Texas public school, kindergarten through 12 social studies classes. And let me say, folks, that although this is being touted as the anti-critical race theory bill, anti-critical race theory act, it really doesn't do that. It's not mentioned there in any way, shape, or form. And if you actually dig into this act, it's not so bad. As I said, it addresses things that must be taught to Texas school children, which include things, such as the history of Native Americans. You have to teach about George Washington, but you also have to teach about Ona Judge. How many knew who Ona Judge is before today? She was one of George Washington's slaves. You teach about Thomas Jefferson, but you also teach about Sally Hemings. You teach about the Federalist Papers, but you also have to teach about the writings from Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and I Have a Dream speech. These are things that the act requires be taught to our children. Now, there are some things that they do not prohibit being taught, but they say you can't require a teacher to teach things like the 1619 Project. You can't require them to teach, for example, I don't know if this pointer comes in, that the advent of slavery in the territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding. Doesn't say you can't teach it, but we're not requiring that you teach it. And by the way, you notice they say United States rather than Texas. So I guess it's, the education board is free to require exactly what Chris and his colleagues are teaching about Texas. And it's interesting that they say that with respect to their relationship to American values, you can't teach that racism is anything other than a deviation from betrayal of failure to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States. That's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. Now, let me say, in the special session, some R's have come back with SB 3, which tries to walk back a lot of this stuff. And so when you see the mark-throughs of what's in the current recently passed act, it looks like we're canceling Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail and I Have a Dream speech as among the things you have to teach. It doesn't prohibit them. But this bill also has some good things. For example, it says you got to prepare kids in Texas school by teaching them media literacy, including instruction on verifying information and sources, identifying and responding to logical fallacies, identifying propaganda as appropriate for the grade level and consistent with the restrictions under this section I was reading out to you. This is exactly the kind of stuff that my wife is trying to teach her freshman and sophomore political science students at UHD. This is a good thing to start teaching children. All in all, SB 3 is very bad because what it takes away from the act that was actually passed in the regular session. Now, interestingly, and I'll leave with this, one of the things that's still required to be taught is the complexity of the historic relationship between Texas and Mexico. And boy, howdy, is that complex. You don't have to go to the comic strip textbooks that I had. I was doing one of the Teach Texas programs out at A-Leaf Middle School, and I was glancing through their Texas history book and came across this page pointing out that Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna fought to make Mexico independent from Texas. And as Ruth points out, well, he succeeded, didn't he? Which kind of shows you that a large part of success is defining your goals. My goal was to get through and get time for y'all to ask questions of Chris. And on that note, I will claim victory and turn it over to Mike.
Thank you very much. And by the way, you got shorted on your introduction. I'll share 2-3 things. They already know how talented a legal brain you have, but you're also the winner of the 2020 ABA Pro Bono Award. And I think you've already told us, you may not have mentioned, most proud of being one of the bar leaders who signed on the bar complaint against our current Attorney General Paxton, which was that just all fun, or was that something, how was that, Allan?
Well, let me say it was important. It was important. I mean, it was an extraordinary group of people. I was honored to be asked to join them. I did not take the lead in writing out the complaint. I was called on because of my decade of experience with the Standing Committee on the Texas Disciplinary Rules of Professional Responsibility. So I'm checking their use of that. And as I say, it's an extraordinary group. It's a serious complaint. And we do expect to see some action with it, just as we were seeing other states do as well with their local insurrectionists.
Well, and
Giuliani.
So Chris, I'll start with you. One question that I kind of was wondering about, when you got the news that you were banned in Austin, was what went through your head was like, thank you, Lord? Was it, oh my God, or what was it? I'm kind of curious about what that first reaction was.
Well, I mean, my first reaction was, my God, he did it. You know, I'm used to seeing TPPF engage in all kinds of hijinks with absolutely minimal effect on anything or anybody. Anyone who covers the legislature knows that, you know, they make more noise than they are effective. So when we received word that we'd been canceled, I thought, wow, well, this is extraordinary. And my second thought is, well, we were ready for this fight. You know, we were expecting a lot of pushback. You don't write a book with Forget the Alamo in red spray paint across the cover and not anticipate trouble. So luckily, I still had an hour left on the drive to Austin, and I wrote the series of emails in my head, or a series of tweets in my head. And as soon as I got to the house, I pulled up to the computer where I'm standing now and started hammering it out. I did not anticipate it going national. I didn't realize it would get us on the New York Times bestseller list.
Really?
But I did. I wanted the fight. I mean, I was like, okay, let's mix it up. You threw a punch, I'm ready to punch back. This is not going to go. I'm not going to go quietly
On there. And so Allan, this is, you kind of touched this a little bit, but when you have a state actor, the lieutenant governor, not just implicitly, but directly saying, by the way, I hate that content, where does that sit in the constitutional cases that you've described for us? In other words, this is a confession. And I think it was on Twitter by the lieutenant governor about, this is a content-based attack that I'm doing at this public forum. How does that square up with the legal authorities you've shared with us?
Sure. I think, as you're right, it is a clear confession that we are barring We are barring speech at what otherwise we let people come in and use as a public forum. And the reason we are doing it is we disagree with their viewpoint.
So a confession, it's a legal confession, so to speak, on Twitter. We've seen that before, maybe on January 6th, but that is.
Well, I think it's even clearer than Trump's. And I mean, there's a question about cause and effect, I suppose, with Trump that we're still investigating. But there is no question that Paxton said why he did it. I disagree with the viewpoint of their version of Texas history. And he brags that as a member of this board, I got the bullet to close it off. And so the Bullock's reason for denying this space as a forum was mine, which was, I don't like this viewpoint.
So Chris, you mentioned a little bit about the Phil Collins aspect. Has this affected your evaluation of Genesis? Because you're kind of in that time frame.
Yeah, yes, I did have favorite Phil Collins songs, and no, I still like the songs, even after reaching out to him and trying to get him to comment, trying to get him to have an interview, and him declining. And yeah, I listened to my favorite Genesis and Phil Collins now with a sad heart.
Well, at least his money is going to effective uses of scammers. What was that surprising to you? How much of the Texas trivia and the memorabilia really is kind of just whatever?
I didn't expect it to be this easy to, I didn't expect the provenance to only go back one sale. Usually you can track an item over 10, 15 sales. There's a history of ownership, and you can kind of you need to look to see where things may have got mixed up. These items were literally discovered by the people who sold them to Collins. So it's just shocking to me how close it was, how easy it was to find the problems. And we didn't even go into the other 200 items that could be just as problematic that we hear rumors about. But, we just didn't have the resources to go through every single item in the collection. I think it's also interesting how George P. Bush supposedly has a report on the provenance of everything in the Collins collection, and he's refusing to turn it over under the Public Information Act. So I think there's trouble there. But I know next week they're going to break ground on a new museum just to house the Collins collection and spend $30 million of taxpayer money to house this stuff. So it's so political. These people have tied it up so much in their political careers that reality doesn't even matter anymore.
Well, it reminds me, I have a brother-in-law that owns a bar in Kansas City, and after he had 2 authentic signed Montana jerseys stolen, he started signing himself. So, yeah. But nobody's asked to spend $30 million of taxpayer money for the wall in his bar for doing that on that. So, Allan, just in terms of kind of the spending taxpayer money on a museum for at least a substantial number of kind of fake stuff, is that something that what would be the legal challenge to that?
Way beyond my wheelhouse. I mean, Chris, you had some thought on that. I mean, I think it's a political crime, right? I mean, we're spending taxpayer money to, I don't think it's just going to house the Collins collection, and Chris and his colleagues point out that there's a lot of authentic stuff that the daughters of the Revolution of Texas were just squirreling away. We're hid it away, letting the rats eat up. And that the authentic stuff does need a new home for it. There's a lot of stuff just sitting over at the land office, some great maps and stuff that need and deserve a museum. But if the public, if the state goes out and says this really is Jim Bowie's knife, or this really is the shot pouch that Crockett had, you know, this state-supported kind of fraud. I'm not sure there is I'm
Well,
not sure there is a legal response.
probably not. Chris, when you're writing this book, I mean, you were raised in Texas. You took Texas history twice, like the rest of us. All these, what I call foundational, not I call, but foundational myths. In other words, you know, Davy Crockett and all these things that we've been taught. Why do you think people hold on to them so much?
Well, you know, conservatives have always considered history as a way of indoctrinating people with patriotism. So you have to put these heroes on a pedestal. You have to create this origin myth of heroism and courage, so that people will be proud of where they come from. They're proud of their ancestors, but also most importantly, that they will emulate their ancestors when it comes time to ask young men and women to pick up a rifle and go to war. I know this as a soldier myself, that I've experienced that. So, you know, it is an inculcation. It's not really an education. And that's why I think for so many people, their identities are tied up in these myths and these legends and these so-called heroes, because that was where they found value in their lives. And it's really hard to try to educate people who've been brainwashed in a particular worldview.
So we've got about 4 minutes, but I want you to use at least 1 minute, Chris, telling us what did you leave out of the book that we really ought to know?
You know, I mean, you know, there's this whole episode with Adina de Zavala and Clara Driscoll that just seemed a lot like a love affair to me, but unfortunately, they both destroyed all of their letters to each other so that no one would ever see what was really behind their initial partnership and then their later lifelong feud. So we had to cut that part of the book, but there was something going on there.
Well, you may, I know Zavala, but tell what you're talking about. I'm not sure, just at least what the suggestion was.
So yeah, Adina de Zavala and Clara Driscoll were the two women in San Antonio who dedicated their lives to convincing the state to take over the entirety of Alamo Plaza and make it a site. Adina had the history, and her grandfather was the first vice president of Texas. Clara Driscoll was the wealthiest woman in Texas at the time, an heiress who would go on to help finance political careers and become a Democratic National Committee woman. She was a really big deal, very wealthy. She was 19. Adina was 39 when they got together to save the Alamo. When the state bought it and turned it over to the Daughters Republic of Texas, Clara wanted to turn it into a park. Adina wanted to preserve it as a battlefield. And that's when they split and became lifelong enemies and fought over how the DRT would care for the Alamo. It's a dramatic story, and it's one that's really not well understood.
I had not heard of that. So we've got two questions that I want to share with you. One of them, I think, is if there's a book that you would say, okay, besides mine, that you might want to buy to talk about the Alamo, what would you recommend?
Harrigan's.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Harrigan is a friend, so I have to pitch him. Gates of the Alamo. It's a novel, but it's probably the best depiction of what I think probably really happened there.
Ditto that.
Second question. There was a lot of non-Anglo support, particularly in San Antonio, for the revolution. What was driving that? Obviously, they were not slave owners, at least not the majority in that area. What did you find in the research was kind of the other threads to create the Texas Revolution?
So the Tejanos had welcomed the Anglo settlement because it gave them an opportunity to make money. They were merchants, and these Anglo slave plantations needed supplies and support and workers. So the Tejanos saw an opportunity to make money, and that kind of drove that alliance in the beginning. When Santa Anna came to power, he suspended the Constitution. The Tejanos wanted to fight Santa Anna to save Mexico from a dictatorship. The Anglos wanted independence. when it became clear that in Texas, the Anglos had the upper hand, the Tejanos chose to team up with the Anglos to whom they had economic ties rather than try to find themselves caught in the middle. It's a very complicated story, hard to explain in 2 minutes, but
You get another minute.
It all comes down to economics. It all comes down to money. How money is made, how money is transferred, and who stands to lose and who stands to win. And for the Tejanos, it made more financial sense to team up with the Anglos than to try to fight Santa Anna on their own.
So it sounds like developers were ruling the day back in San Antonio back then too.
Yeah, no, Andrew Torgett's book, Seeds of Empire, is like a deep dive into this. It is a textbook. It's not easy read, but if you want to understand, I covered 9 wars as a war correspondent. They all had to do with money in the end. And that was equally true of the Texas Revolution.
Got it. Were you always this cynical, or was it all the covering the wars that did it?
I'm known as an optimist in my profession. I'm just saying.
Well, thank you both for joining us. I'll let you finish with whatever you like, Allan. Any other closing thoughts or suggestions or calls to arms for our members that you think make sense?
Well, I don't know about a call to arms, but these are important lessons to know where we came from. I mean, in the comic book textbook and otherwise, we revere Sam Houston as the man of integrity who so loved Texas, he tried to keep it in the Union. So growing up in Huntsville was segregated until like 9th grade, my 9th grade in 1969. And I would literally, to get to my white elementary school, walk past the Samuel W. Houston Elementary School for Colored Children. Right. And it was only later when I was doing some of the affirmative action work with the University of Texas, I dug into that. And, you know, Samuel W. Houston, they always talk about his being an early pioneering educator for Negroes. What they don't point out is that in 1864, he was born into slavery. He and his father Joshua were Sam Houston's slaves. So, you know, I'm for the Union, says Houston, but he was part of this slave economy as well.
Thanks. So we're going to make another try at the, and Chris, I'm going to let you go. We're going to have another try September 9th at doing it live at Kim Son. We picked it because it's a massive room, and we will have another speaker coming up. But Chris, thank you so much for being here. What's your closing thought that you're kind of holding back for our members?
You know, I would just say that we are experiencing a level of authoritarianism and in this state that we probably haven't seen in 50 years. And it's happening with free speech, with education, with voting rights. It's a cross the board assault on civil rights. And sadly, I think we're just beginning. And the shutting down of my event is just a prelude to what I think will probably be even greater authoritarian action in the future. So don't let your guards down. This is really just the beginning.
You know, I think I know why they call you an optimist. You were smiling when you just said all that stuff.
That's it.
Thank you all very much. Hopefully we'll see you. Keep our fingers crossed September 9th. We're also going to remain for all the statewide folks virtual as well. But thank you so much for joining us and making this another successful webinar, and have a great day.